You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In our most recent episode, Joe Edelman took us into the early American world of coffee and how a simple, everyday drink carried political meaning, economic power, and social change. But coffee wasn't the only commodity bound up with protest and power. When early Americans rejected British tea after 1773, they didn't just stop drinking it. They found new ways to supply their wants and needs. Now, some of those ways were perfectly legal. Others, let's just say they sailed in the shadows of empire. After the 7 Years' War, British officials claimed that smuggling was a really big problem in their North American colonies. So Parliament responded with measures like the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Tea Act of 1773, which were laws that not only imposed new duties, but also tried to steer colonists away from illicit trade by lowering prices on legally imported British goods. So, just how big was the North American smuggling problem? Why did British Americans continue to import goods like tea illegally from Dutch and French merchants when they could have just bought similar goods legally and at lower prices from British merchants? Was smuggling really all about lower prices, or did something deeper drive American choices? To explore these questions, we're revisiting episode 161, Smuggling and the American Revolution. In this episode, we zoom out to the wider Atlantic world and then narrow in on the vibrant, often illicit trade networks that connected British North America with Dutch ports and the small but powerful island of St. Eustatius, which was known as the Golden Rock of 18th century commerce. You'll hear from three historians. Fabrizio Prato, who helps us see smuggling not as an exception, but as a normal part of everyday trade across imperial borders in the 18th century Atlantic world. Christian Coate, who explains how and why British Americans turned to Dutch traders, especially for goods like tea, and how this trade pushed them towards new ideas about economic self-determination. And Wim Klooster, who takes us to the island of St. Eustatius and shows us how this tiny Dutch island played an outsized role in supplying the American war effort and shaping the outcome at the Battle of Yorktown. Together, these historians reveal how everyday choices about where to buy sugar, tea, and other goods intersected with big questions about loyalty, law, and liberty, and how the world of seemingly ordinary smuggling helped fuel an extraordinary revolution. But first, do you love early American history but wish you had a guide? This January, the History Explorers Club is officially opening its doors. This club is an online community for curious history lovers who want trustworthy scholarship, great conversation, and bite-sized ways to explore the past in a way that fits into your life. During our grand opening, the week of January 19th, we'll share special events and early access opportunities that you won't want to miss. So join the waitlist now so you get all of the launch details. Visit historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. All right, are you ready to revisit the hidden world of smuggling and see how it connects to the stories that we've been exploring about coffee, tea, and the politics of everyday life in early America? Let's go meet our expert guides. Now, we should begin our investigation by exploring the wider Atlantic world. Both Great Britain and its American colonies were residents and traders in this world. And by zooming out on how trade was conducted in the Atlantic as a whole, we'll be better able to understand why Great Britain believed that smuggling was a big problem. Now, to see this bigger picture of the 18th century Atlantic world, we should visit with Fabrizio Prato. Fabrizio is an assistant professor of Latin American studies at the College of William and Mary and a scholar of the Atlantic. He's the author of the book Edge of Empire, Atlantic Networks and Revolution in Bourbon, Rio de la Plata, in which he explores the trans-imperial borders and borderlands of the 18th century Atlantic world. Fabrizio, we're trying to better understand the Atlantic world in the 18th century. It seems like it was a really busy and crowded space in terms of the number of European nations involved in trade and settlement there, and we wonder if you would provide us with an overview of what the Atlantic world looked like in the 18th century.
Yes, the Atlantic world was indeed a very crowded space in terms of the number of European nations involved in trade and settlement. And I think that the 18th century is the first moment that we have really many competing old and new actors in the Atlantic world. In the beginning, like the 1500s, you see Spain and Portugal taking the lead and, finding and establishing colonies in the New World. And later, Britain and France and the Dutch, they all try to catch up with Spain and Portugal. And that is in the 18th century that they really not only catch up with the Iberians, but in the case of France and Britain, they surpass them. So we will see that the South Atlantic, it was more an area of influence of the Iberian empires, and they kept that in the 18th century. So you see, like Portugal was able to keep pretty much what you call Portuguese America, what would be Brazil today. And Spain had big viceroyalty in Peru that extended what today is Chile, Ecuador, and what would be Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. Rio de la Plata region is also an area of influence of Spain. In the Caribbean, that's where we see most of the rivalry and competition of these empires, where you see the British, the French, Dutch, and of course Spain as well, competing for colonies and territories. And North America would be an area that initially Spain has a lot of influence, but the British slowly carved and the French carved the space there. So it was in the 18th century that you have like this full concert of European empires now, established with their, interests very clear. And we have this full moment of European rivalry. It's also a moment that is not clear that one single empire controls or have hegemony. So I would say that it's also a multipolar Atlantic world in the 18th century.
You mentioned that the Iberians were the first to settle the Atlantic world in the 1500s, and that all the other European nations had to slowly carve places out for themselves. So what exactly was the draw of North and South America and the Caribbean? I mean, why were European nations so anxious to find their own space and place within the Atlantic world?
Well, the Atlantic world is like, we have to think like, what are these people looking for? And in other words, would be like wealth. For them, wealth was at this moment silver and gold, bullion, right? That was like the empires measured their wealth, their mindset of the time. If you don't own mines, you can bring and capture this wealth, precious metals via trade. So you need to find new products, you need to find labor, you need to find hopefully silver mines or gold mines to produce this wealth. So since the 1500s, the Portuguese and the Spaniards have been exploring like from the Canary Islands, the Azores, the coast of Africa, and then eventually the Americas, always with this goal of finding precious metals and enabling trade routes with Asia, right, where you can really find goods that were extremely valuable in Europe. So that's trade that will be accumulating wealth. So the Iberians were the first ones to set foot in the Americas and start colonies here. The Spaniards, even though Columbus was wrong and did not arrive in India, they were extremely lucky because they found big empires like the Incas or the Aztecs that had a lot of bullion, pretty much gold and silver. The Portuguese, right, in the beginning did not find precious metals in what would be Brazil, but they found that Brazil, for instance, was a great place to plant sugar, which was a very, very valuable good for European empires, therefore a way of trading and having access to bullion. So that's pretty much the motivation to find new resources to promote trade and also to find labor. We cannot forget about that. European empires were able to find labor pools here, like indigenous labor that will be in the beginning. Indigenous people would be enslaved, and you have other forms of extracting labor, many times in a coerced way from indigenous people. And later you'll see enslaved Africans being brought to the New World to labor in these colonies to produce these goods that will become big staples of globalization. Sugar, coffee, cotton, all of these products that were produced in the Americas for the Atlantic trade in order to produce the ultimate goal to accumulate this wealth that at this time period was pretty much bullion.
Since we're talking about ideas of wealth, we should probably also talk about the reigning economic philosophy of this early modern period, which was mercantilism. Fabrizio, would you tell us about mercantilist ideas and how they impacted the development of trade in the Atlantic world?
Well, absolutely. And that is crucial for us to understand the motivations and the strategies that these people, these historical agents, what motivated them back in the 18th century. So when this European empire started setting up these colonies in the New World, there was this ideal that trade, that the mercantile system was crucial for obtaining wealth. And in the minds of these people in these metropoles in Europe, these colonies were supposed to actually produce wealth for the empire. So these mercantilist ideas, we try to acquire wealth, this bullion that I've been mentioning here, silver, the so famous pieces of eight that the pirates of the Caribbean really were looking for. And if you don't have silver mines, you need to trade for. And the important thing is to be sure that when you have a trading relationship, that the metropole of a specific empire would have advantages in that relationship. So mercantilism was an ideal of protecting trade and making trade always more advantageous for a specific empire. So that's why, for instance, you're going to see that in Iberian America or in Spanish America, Portuguese America, for instance, Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro or Pernambuco, other foreign empires but Portugal were not allowed to trade. So Portugal would be sure that they were profiting and their rivals were not being able to profit from their colonies without dealing with Lisbon and Lisbon ensuring that Portugal had an advantage in this relationship. Same thing with the Spaniards. The Spaniards didn't want the British and the French profiting out from the silver mines of Bolivia, right, Upper Peru, or the gold and silver of Mexico. So what you see is that these mercantilist policies that make colonies and their markets exclusive markets of their metropoles. If you think like all those reforms that we've seen happening in the 18th century Anglo-America leading to the revolution, they were actually kind of attempts of copying these more strict mercantilist views that European empires, like the Iberian empires, put in place to protect their profit out from their colonies and protect exclusive access to trade in labor and resources from these colonies.
Now, how did European empires attempt to follow these tenets of mercantilism and contain trade within their own empires? I mean, it really doesn't seem like the Atlantic world was ever a place with strict borders.
I think that the key for that question is that they attempted. I don't think that they actually succeeded. So you have all these laws that foreigners were not allowed in a colony of a specific country. You have that foreign ships could not dock in the ports of the colonies of another country. And in order to enforce that, the metropoles would send bureaucrats. They passed these regulations and they would send bureaucrats. But it was very difficult to be sure that the local elite, the local authorities would always be looking to protect the interests of the metropoles. So what we see is that these mercantilist views are much more prescriptive and ideal set of policies than actually how things operated on the ground. We see that officially, for instance, just for us to have an idea on how clumsy this system was. If you're thinking about a city like Buenos Aires is like in Atlantic South America, in Rio de la Plata. It's, an Atlantic port, but it was not authorized to send ships to the Atlantic. According to Spanish mercantilist policies, Buenos Aires was supposed to be supplied with all goods from Peru through Lima. So you have like all the goods to get to Panama, cross the Isthmus, go again in a ship to the Pacific, disembark all the goods in Callao, the port of Lima, to go up to the Andes, down south, down the Andes to Buenos Aires. So it's a very clumsy system that made it very expensive, the goods offered by it, and very inefficient. So all these sets of policies that are created to protect the interests of the metropoles actually didn't work very well. And many of the officials understood that. Therefore, they were open to other alternatives, what one could call more easily these days smuggling.
Yeah, this is really interesting because it does seem like although mercantilism dictated that all these European nations should contain trade within established imperial borders, and even though you have all these European nations out there imposing laws to create closed imperial borders and systems of trade, your research reveals that those who actually lived in the 18th century Atlantic world actually resisted the attempts of European governments to enclose them within imperial boundary lines. So, Fabrizio, would you tell us how people around the Atlantic really conducted trade? How did they actually respond to all these mercantilist laws imposed by their respective empires?
That's a great question because actually, again, these European empires have these ideals of how colonists and authorities, around the Atlantic world should behave. But when you're living in a colony, you have a family, you have a network of people, there is a society and a community that actually have concrete needs, goods, like they need access to resources. And sometimes these mercantilist policies just were not really helpful. So what we see is that the local interests, local communities, local authorities had very different interests than the authorities back in Europe. So many times, for instance, we'll see that it's inevitable that foreigners would try to attempt to trade with Spanish, Portuguese colonies or vice versa, right? British and French traders would try also to tap into the markets that were close to the Spaniards, especially regarding silver. So a big strategy here is the so-called emergency landing, what the Spaniards call arribadas. For instance, even though British or French ships were not allowed to enter into Portuguese or Spanish ports, if they were distressed at sea, they could call in and request this emergency landing. That was part of this new body of laws and doctrines that were emerging, so-called natural law, that, it's a matter of principle of civilization. You don't allow individuals to starve and die on sea. You have mercy and allow them into the port. So that is, for instance, one strategy of going around these mercantilist prescriptions, because once these foreign ships enter into a port, they were normally allowed to disembark merchandise and to sell them, at least to pay for the repairs that they needed or the supplies that they needed to continue their voyage. And of course, once things are off the boat, then it's very difficult to control what is just the necessary quantity, right? And that's one way of smuggling. Another important way that we have to keep in mind, these merchant houses back in the day, they were kind of like big family-run business. So sometimes you'll see that some families, you have Portuguese families that span Dutch colonies, Spanish colonies, and Portuguese colonies. So they also would find ways of sending information, of sending goods based on their family networks, not necessarily observing the prescriptive, the mercantilist rules that the Iberian empires were always trying to push into them. So although you have these very rigid mercantilist views and policies, trade was way more flexible. Because these empires, even though they wanted to be strong and be able to control the movement of every single merchant and ship, they were not able to do so. They depended on the will of colonial subjects. And as I said again, there were other interests in the colonies and this group of people that did not match necessarily what the regulations that the metropoles were trying to impose.
You raised the issue of smuggling, which, of course, was a big deal in British North America around the period of the American Revolution. And I wonder if there was a standard definition of what smuggling meant in the 18th century. Because from the way you've described it, it sounds like you smuggled anytime you crossed an imperial border with goods. And given how crowded the Atlantic world was, crossing imperial borders wasn't a very hard thing to do.
Well, actually, that sounds weird, but exactly what it was. Smuggling, if you were just wandering around the Atlantic world, smuggling was almost inevitable. Because, yes, smuggling is the untaxed movement of goods and people. So when you cross a border, without paying taxes, or you're crossing a border in which you're not supposed to be crossing that border in the first place. That is smuggling. Smuggling is going against the regulation of one state regarding what you are allowed or not allowed to do in regarding to trade. Also, we can call smuggling untaxed trade, for instance, or we can call smuggling direct trade. But it's important to keep in mind here that smuggling is also a relational concept. So when you think that, oh, he is a smuggler, well, in the eyes of whom, right? Because if you have, for instance, a Dutch trader that leaves the Netherlands, paying all his taxes and, everything is fine, gets to, let's say, Buenos Aires and tries to sell there. He is not going against any laws of the Netherlands. Nevertheless, in the eyes of the Spanish Empire, that is smuggling. So we have to keep in mind that smuggling is always in the eye of the beholder. But every time that someone is crossing a line and not paying taxes or going against an imperial regulation, that would be smuggling. So every time that a ship touched a foreign port, we can say that smuggling was happening. And we know that in the Atlantic world of the 18th century, with these many empires competing and a huge increase in trade and interactions between empires, even in the slave trade, more and more ships were touching foreign ports. And I would say even that by the late 18th century, touching foreign ports and smuggling is not an exception, but the rule of interactions in the Atlantic world.
What's striking about this conversation is that when we study the American Revolution, we tend to get this idea that British North Americans were the only people in the Atlantic world who were smuggling. But from our conversation, it really seems like smuggling was the way of the Atlantic in the 18th century, and that anyone who was trading in this illegal way.
Yeah, and I would say that that's absolutely true. Everybody's doing it because how come that, at this moment, these economies, these empires are so interdependent, right? You have like sugar from Brazil being sold in London. We have African slaves being coercively transported across the Atlantic. And once in the Americas, they are going to be shipped also to other destinations crossing imperial borders. If you think about how the importance of the British and the Portuguese and supplying enslaved Africans to Spain. So you see that there's a lot of smuggling. In the Caribbean, the Spanish colonies, they couldn't produce wheat very often, and so they rely on North American wheat. So even for basic needs, we see that crossing imperial lines was very common. And I would say that absolutely, smuggling is a normal pattern, and everybody is smuggling. And we have to keep in mind it's not by chance that the ideas of free trade appear precisely in the middle to the end of the 18th century. So in South America, Brazil, for instance, Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Pernambuco, all these important merchant communities, they would more and more often interact with Spaniards, trade with the British, and even with the United States after the Revolution.
The Atlantic world was a very crowded, competitive place during the 18th century. A place where many European empires were trying to follow the tenets of mercantilism by regulating trade in such a way that their empire gained economic advantage. Of course, what empires hoped would happen with these regulations and what really happened with them are two different stories. Imperial ideas about how colonists should live and trade rarely matched how colonists actually lived and traded, so far removed as they were from the seats of imperial power. For most colonists, imperial trade laws proved too cumbersome and expensive to follow, and too difficult to enforce. Therefore, on the ground, colonists often found easier and cheaper ways of selling and acquiring the goods they needed. And in the eyes of the imperial states, these cheaper and easier ways constituted smuggling, the act of conducting untaxed trade across imperial boundary lines. But in the eyes of the colonists, allowing foreign ships to make so-called emergency landings, or crossing a river, or even sailing to a neighboring island was really just a way to buy and sell goods conveniently. Plus, given how often European empires waged war against each other in this early modern period, and traded territories in the Atlantic as a result of those wars, it was often the case that inter-imperial trade allowed friends and family members to stay connected and to continue a trade that had been legal before their homelands had changed imperial hands. Now, I think the big thing to keep in mind from our conversation with Fabrizio is that smuggling was not an exception in the 18th century. It wasn't just something that British North Americans were doing or something that just the British government was concerned with. Smuggling was an accepted form of untaxed trade that occurred everywhere in the Atlantic world, and that imperial governments, like Great Britain, often allowed to happen given how difficult it was to enforce trade regulations. And when we think of smuggling this way, it must have been really startling for colonists in British North America to find out that starting in 1764, Great Britain intended to enforce its trade restrictions and thereby disrupt their everyday trade practices. Now, Fabrizio certainly helped us better understand trade in the 18th century Atlantic world in a global or general sense. But how did this trade work more specifically? And if smuggling was really the way of normal trade in the Atlantic world, then was it really a big problem in British North America? During our conversation, Fabrizio mentioned the Dutch and how it was not uncommon to see a Dutch ship in every port. And this comment reminds us of something our guest historians told us in both episode 159 and episode 160. British North Americans liked trading with the Dutch. They especially liked trading for cheap Dutch tea. So why don't we explore how the Dutch traded in the Atlantic so we can discover more specifics about how trade and smuggling worked and just how involved British North Americans were involved in this trade. To find answers to our questions, we should speak with Christian Coate, an associate professor of history and the director of the American Studies program at Towson University. Christian is an expert in the Atlantic world, specifically in connections between the Dutch and British Atlantic worlds. In fact, he's written 2 books on the subject: Empire at the Periphery, British Colonists, Anglo-Dutch Trade, and the Development of the British Atlantic, 1621 to 1713, and a biography of a map in motion, Augustine Hermann's Chesapeake. I think our adventure into the Dutch Atlantic will be fun and really informative. But before we visit with Christian, let's talk about our sponsor.
You know, every time I sit down with a guest historian, I'm reminded of something. Good history takes time, care, and resources. The research behind each interview, the careful myth-busting, the effort to bring you trustworthy stories about the people who shaped early America, that all matters. And it's all supported by listeners like you. Right now, we're in the middle of our end-of-year fundraising campaign, which began on Giving Tuesday, and something really special is happening. A generous fan of Ben Franklin's World has stepped forward to match every donation twice, up to $3,700. And as of today, we're 77% of the way to that goal, which means that your gift, whether it's a one-time, monthly, or annual donation, will go 3 times as far in supporting the show. So if Ben Franklin's World has ever helped you see the past more clearly or brought a moment of curiosity into your day, I hope you'll consider supporting the show right now, and your dollars will be tripled. Your gift directly supports the production of this podcast, so all the research, audio editing, hosting, and all the work that goes into creating the in-depth, trustworthy conversations that you can rely on. So please help support Ben Franklin's World. You can do it at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And to those who have already contributed, you help support this work. You help make this work possible. And I'm so deeply grateful. Thank you. Thank you for your support. And thank you, my friend, for listening, for your generosity, and for being a part of this amazing community of people who know that history matters.
Christian, thank you so much for joining us. We're exploring trade and smuggling in the 18th century Atlantic world, and we'd like to develop a better understanding of how the Dutch traded and smuggled with British North Americans. So, would you tell us a bit about the Dutch presence in the Atlantic world during the 18th century?
So by the beginning of the 18th century, the Dutch Atlantic Empire was much smaller than it had been a century earlier. In the middle of the 1650s, the Dutch controlled significant territorial colonies, including New Netherland in North America, as well as perhaps most significantly, regions in what is today Brazil, where they had a series of sugar plantations. By the late 1650s, however, they had lost most of those colonies. And by the time the 18th century began, the Dutch controlled essentially a number of islands,
Curacao off the coast of what is today Venezuela. Perhaps most importantly, St. Eustatius, which is in the Lesser Antilles. If you go sort of south and east from Puerto Rico, there's a tangle of islands, some English, some French, and Eustatia was the most important island there. They also controlled some plantation colonies along the coast of what is today Suriname, but these are relatively small, only a few thousand inhabitants and several small plantations. And by the 18th century, they also held on to a couple of slave trading forts on the west coast of Africa. And that was essentially the empire. It was largely a commercial empire rather than a territorial empire, as you might imagine, with the British or the French, for example, who control significant amounts of territory. The Dutch, nevertheless, trade through these ports.
It's really interesting that the Dutch were able to survive and even thrive in the 18th century Atlantic world, given that, as you mentioned, they only had a few plantation colonies, which were the type of colonies that really enriched other empires. So I wonder if you would tell us more about this Dutch commercial empire and specifically about the development of the Dutch transit trade.
So the center of the Dutch Empire is Amsterdam itself and the United Provinces. And this developed in the beginning of the 17th century as Europe's economic powerhouse. The Dutch had several advantages. Some of them are technological. They had leaped ahead of other European rivals in shipbuilding technology, for example. They also controlled much of the fisheries in the North Sea, particularly the herring fishery. And we might not think about fish today, but fish are so essential to an economy because in the 17th century, before refrigeration, they were easily preserved and could be a fundamental source of protein. So the Dutch control trade in the Baltic, grain, lumber supplies, and fish, and they also have trade routes that connect them to the Mediterranean. So in the 17th century, Amsterdam became in some ways an entrepot that pulled commodities from all over Europe in and then sent them back out again. With Dutch advantages in shipbuilding, they turned themselves into the carrier. The English would criticize the Dutch in the 17th century as they would call them the carriers of the Atlantic, essentially not producing things, but making money by moving things around. And they do a similar thing in the Atlantic. They take the advantages they have in the Netherlands in shipbuilding that enables them to build ships more efficiently, to sail those ships more quickly. The capital markets of Amsterdam are advanced, much lower interest rates about 3 to 4%, as opposed to 6 to 10% in a place like England. And this allows merchants to borrow money more cheaply, to invest in trade. So in the Atlantic, they build what historians often call the transit trade. And they essentially use their islands, places like St. Eustatius, places like Curacao, to move goods through. So they bring European manufactured goods that come from their extensive European trade networks. They bring them into these islands and then exchange them at other ports, particularly English and French colonies. And this trade began in the early part of the 17th century. As the English and French were setting up plantation colonies, Dutch merchants who were already operating in the Caribbean began to offer goods for sale. And French and English colonists who were busy trying to plant tobacco and plant sugar were desperate for supplies, for European manufactured goods, textile, metal goods, things to outfit their homes and to outfit their plantations. And the Dutch traders showed up willing to buy tobacco and sugar. In a period before particularly English mercantile networks had developed to the extent that they would later on, the Dutch were essential trading partners for English colonists in Barbados and Antigua, and in the Chesapeake as well. So during the first half of the 17th century, the Dutch and English in many ways collaborate on the building of English colonies. English planters benefit by getting cheap goods and somebody to buy their plantation supplies, and Dutch merchants get a source of tobacco and sugar that they didn't necessarily have elsewhere. By the second half of the 17th century, particularly by the 1660s, as the Dutch have lost Dutch Brazil, where they had grown significant amounts of sugar, this transit trade becomes the way that the Dutch get direct access to sugar and tobacco. And as this trade evolved, it becomes not just Dutch merchants stopping speculatively at a number of English ports, but rather becomes firmly established. In a place like Montserrat, for example, in the 1650s, there are several Dutch warehouses, and Dutch men, essentially factors, they're representing Dutch mercantile firms living on these colonies, warehousing European goods, trading them for tobacco and sugar, warehousing those goods, and coordinating the arrival of Dutch shipping to take them off again. So we have a significant blending here of Dutch and English people to make these colonies successful. Over time, as the English Empire gets better at regulating its trade, better at supplying colonists, they become concerned with the presence of Dutch merchants. They're worried that they're essentially siphoning off trade from the empire. So those Dutch representatives are pushed out. Nevertheless, these islands, places like Curacao, places like St. Eustatius, are very close to English islands. And the Dutch essentially moved their operations to these islands and began using them as the warehouses to trade among French, English, and Spanish colonies as well. And this is true in the Caribbean. This is also true in North America. Here it was a little easier with the presence of New Netherlands, what is today New York. The Dutch had established that colony originally as a base for the fur trade up what becomes the Hudson River to trade with Iroquois and other indigenous populations. But very quickly, the Dutch begin trading, and these are independent Dutch merchants largely, begin trading from Manhattan, from New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, to English colonies in the Chesapeake and in New England as well. And the same factors are at work. These are Chesapeake tobacco planters that are desperate for trade. The close proximity of Dutch colonists enables that trade to work. And eventually, significant numbers of Dutchmen move into Virginia and Maryland. Some become planters themselves. They marry into English families. And there they create the kinds of commercial networks that will sustain this trade really through the 1660s and 1670s.
So it really sounds like the 17th century, and I guess even the 16th century development of Dutch trade in Europe and the Atlantic world paved the way for the development of the 18th century Atlantic transit trade. I mean, the Dutch used all of the technology and connections they had forged in those earlier periods to fuel their trade in the 18th century.
Yes, that's right. So essentially there is this, one would think of it almost as habits of trade that evolve, but those habits are not just habits, they're pathways. People know about markets, they know what goods are available, they learn the seasons where goods are produced. So those kinds of ties create a foundation that then gets built on. And part of that, too, is these familial relationships. In New Netherlands, there are family connections both in New England, but also to the Chesapeake. In the Caribbean, the familial networks that are more important tend to be actually Sephardic Jewish. Amsterdam had long been relatively friendly to Jewish migrants, many of them fleeing Inquisition in Spanish and Portuguese territories. They had gone from Amsterdam into the Atlantic as Atlantic trade expanded, as people from all over the world did that had come to the Dutch Republic. And those Sephardic traders, based both in Dutch colonies, but also in English colonies, French colonies, and Spanish colonies, and many of them had gone to Spanish colonies essentially to escape the Inquisition, create familial networks that enable this kind of trade. So we have this foundation, I think you're right about that, this foundation laid in the middle of the 17th century that extends into the 18th century, that's based upon habit, that's based upon the knowing of markets, but also is deeply enmeshed with family relationships.
So we have all of these people who live outside of the Dutch Empire, like British North Americans, who are really in the habit of trading with Dutch traders by the 18th century. What happened to this American and Atlantic form of trade when Great Britain started passing the Navigation Acts, which were designed to keep as much of the Atlantic trade as possible within the British Empire?
That's a great question. So this is perhaps most an example in New York, what becomes New York City, right? New York is conquered by the English in 1664, largely because they see New Amsterdam and New Netherland as siphoning off trade in North America. Governors in New England, for example, complain about competition for the fur trade. English tobacco traders complain that Dutch merchants are siphoning trade out of Virginia and Maryland. And this is one of the reasons that leads to the conquest of New Netherland by the English in 1664. But Dutch traders can go anywhere. The Dutch traders who live in Manhattan, in what had been New Amsterdam, become English citizens. This is where they live. This is where their family ties live. Yet they hold on to the kinds of connections that enable them to continue to trade. So as the Navigation Acts get passed, first in the 1650s, and then sort of reaffirmed and extended in the 1660s and after, many traders that had been trading continue to trade as they had. The Navigation Acts are designed to push them out, but one of the things that they actually do is in some cases they encourage more trade, more illegal trade. And the reason they do that is because they artificially raise the price of imported goods. So one reason that English merchants are trading with the Dutch is because Dutch merchants are able to supply manufactured goods cheaper. And sometimes they can provide them as much as 30 and 40% cheaper. And that's in many ways about the technical advantages of production and credit in the Netherlands. So if they're going to do that, if the English are going to pass a law that makes that trade illegal, or at least funnels that trade first through England and then to the colonies, what they've done is actually artificially raise the price of imported goods, which means that continuing to trade with a Dutch representative or a Dutch individual is even more attractive than it had been before. So the Navigation Acts, in theory, are supposed to stop this trade, but in reality, it never actually happened, so it never fully worked.
And we also know that people are creatures of habit. They don't like change. And in the years before the Navigation Acts, British colonists had developed a habit of trade with the Dutch. Then Parliament comes in, imposes the Navigation Acts, and all of a sudden, these regular trading habits became illegal. Of course, these trading habits continued anyway, but under what the British government termed as smuggling.
So here's one of the great things about this idea of smuggling, and it's really all about perspective, right? So if you're in a British colony in the 18th century, smuggling can mean all kinds of different things. It can mean evading import and export duties. It can mean going around a state monopoly, such as the Royal African Company, which for most of the 17th and early 18th century controls the trade in enslaved Africans. It could also mean just violating local rules about trading at a certain location as opposed to another location. Or it could mean trading particular goods. Most commonly, we think of smuggling in the frame of the Navigation Acts, right? Trade that was outside of the empire, that was foreign trade. But here's where perspective really matters. So colonists who have been trading the way that they always have get told that their trade, these sort of habits that they've established for decades, are no longer legal. Well, the smuggling to them then is not really a violation of the law of nature. And Adam Smith has a great line about this in The Wealth of Nations, written at the end of the 18th century, where he talks about smugglers aren't people who violate the laws of nature. Rather, what he says is that essentially smugglers are excellent citizens who have the law changed on them. And it's not really that they try to smuggle, it's that what they had always been doing gets termed smuggling all of a sudden. And that's one of the other really important things to say about smuggling in the 17th and 18th centuries. We tend to think about smuggling in terms of something like illegal drugs today. People who are involved in the moving of illegal drugs, because those drugs are legal by definition, what they're doing is smuggling, and there is no legitimate drug trade. But in the 18th century, smugglers didn't smuggle all the time. Smugglers traded some things legally and some things illegally. It depended upon the options that were available to them. They didn't set out to break the law. And sometimes they even combined legal and illegal trade. So one of the most common things that happens in the 17th and early 18th century is, as we said, the Navigation Acts essentially say that colonial trade of valuable goods, what were called the enumerated goods, these are things like tobacco and sugar and furs, these things have to go to England before they can go anywhere else in Europe. And at the same time, when buying imported manufactured goods from Europe, those things have to come from England. Even if they're produced somewhere else, say in the Netherlands, they need to go first to England and then to the colonies. And the reason for this is that the metropolitan officials in England can collect duties on these, and that the English economy benefits from this trade. What we have, for example, in New York or in the Caribbean, what happens is that it's legal to send enumerated goods, to send tobacco or sugar, for example, to the Dutch Republic as long as you stop in England first, pay duties on your cargo, and then continue on to the Dutch Republic. But what, of course, merchants end up doing is they do this. They follow the technicalities of the rule, yet they only pay duties on a small percentage. They hide some of the cargo, for example. And, Barbados merchants are notorious for this, as are Philadelphia and New York merchants at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. But this sort of combination of legal and illegal trade suggests to us that when colonists thought about smuggling, they didn't think of themselves as rule breakers or as lawbreakers. Rather, what they're doing is combining a variety of strategies so that they can succeed, so that they can profit. And it's the imperial government who is changing the rules. This matter of perspective also matters when thinking about the Dutch, because for Dutch merchants, English laws that say that their trade is illegal don't apply to them. So by breaking the English Navigation Acts, they're in fact not breaking the law at all. Only from the perspective of another empire are they breaking the law. And the same thing's true with Dutch trade to French colonies or to Spanish colonies as well.
I wonder if you would talk to us a bit about the rivalry between Great Britain and the Netherlands, because it's a rivalry with a fairly long history, and one that seems to have really informed the English decision to try and stifle Dutch trade in both North America and in the Caribbean.
Yeah, the Dutch and English have this very interesting relationship in the 17th and early 18th century. As Protestant nations, in many ways, they're tied together. There are a significant number of Englishmen that are in the Netherlands helping them in their war against the Spanish at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century. But by the time we get to the middle of the 17th century, as the English are attempting to create a agricultural empire, beginning to grow tobacco and sugar and wanting to capture the profits from that trade, they begin to see the Dutch as a obstacle. And in fact, the Navigation Acts, which the first one is passed in 1651, are explicitly targeted at the Dutch Republic. There are, if you look at sort of the pamphlet production in England, sort of political and economic pamphlets, these are targeted specifically at the Dutch. They have this sort of love-hate relationship. Many pamphleteers talk about how England, who's lagging behind in its economic development from the Dutch Republic, should imitate what the Dutch are doing. But in trying to imitate what the Dutch are doing, they, of course, are faced with the idea that it's, in fact, Dutch traders who are carrying many of their plantation goods. So we have the Navigation Acts passed first in 1651, and then again after the restoration of Charles II in 1660 and through essentially that decade. They're trying specifically to push the Dutch out of the overseas English carrying trade. At the same time, the nations fight 3 wars in the 17th century and another in the 18th century that are largely commercial wars. These are wars at sea in which the English are using the naval fleet to essentially engage in a commercial war to hurt the Dutch ability to continue to erode their trade. So very much so, the tension and the laws of the 17th century are directed exactly at trying to push the Dutch out and to recapture trade by the English.
Now, we know that after the French and Indian or 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Great Britain had a huge war debt that it had to find ways to raise revenue to pay off. And one of the ways it attempted to raise revenue was to crack down on smuggling in North America. So, Christian, would you tell us just how big of a problem smuggling was for British North America during the mid to late 18th century, and how much of a role the Dutch played in facilitating that smuggling?
By the time we get to the 7 Years' War, the Dutch have been in a little bit of trouble, right? So the Dutch are not as dominant as they had been 50 years earlier. And some of that's about catch up. Essentially, England's economy is catching up to the Dutch economy, and its advantages in production and textile production and production of other kinds of manufactured goods is now being matched by the English. The capital markets that the Dutch had developed are now in many ways being matched by the English as well. So those advantages that had made the Dutch transit trade so productive were largely disappearing by the time we get to the mid to late 18th century. That being said, North American merchants living in British North America were now driving much of the trade with Dutch colonies. And it's not just Dutch colonies, it's also French colonies. And this is often that molasses trade that's talked about that begins essentially in the early part of the 18th century and really flourishes by the middle of the 18th century. And that trade is essentially driven by the production of provisions, foodstuffs, largely dairy products and wheat in places like Philadelphia and the Mid-Atlantic region and in New England. The main market for those goods had originally been British sugar plantations in the British West Indies. Lumber is another one of these goods, barrel staves and lumber. By the time you get, however, to the 1710s, the British sugar plantations weren't growing as rapidly because the land that they already had was under cultivation. And the rivalry was now coming from the French, who were growing in this period. So we have New England and Mid-Atlantic merchants increasingly trading to French islands, but also to Dutch islands like Curacao and St. Eustatius, who are themselves trading to the French. So they're sending provisions, foodstuffs, to these islands along with lumber, and in return they're getting molasses and rum, right? These are products that are produced by sugar. This trade, by the way, is completely legal. These are not enumerated goods, and thus this trade is illegal. What becomes illegal is that sugar sometimes comes back as well. Eventually in 1733, because British sugar planters are complaining about increased competition, largely from French planters, the English passed this law called the Molasses Act in 1733, which puts a tax on the importation of French molasses. And it's designed to stop this trade. But it doesn't. And it doesn't because British North Americans need to trade with someone. And they continue to do so, to trade to French islands and to trade to Dutch islands as well. By the time we then get to the 7 Years' War, which is where your question began, that trade remained significant. And the presence of increasing numbers of British officials that had come during the 7 Years' War, particularly naval officers, are outraged that they see, even during a war with the French, North American merchants continuing to trade with French islands. So that's some of what's driving these new attempts to crack down on North American trade after the war. It's trade that had already existed, but now sort of become newly visible to English officials. The other part of that, and this is perhaps where the Dutch are specifically more important, is the tea trade. For a variety of reasons that had to do with English and Dutch rivalry in the East, where they had access to tea plantations and to the production of tea, the English East India Company, which was a monopoly company that controlled tea, wasn't very efficient at selling tea to the colonies. It required colonists to buy large amounts of tea at auction. Many North American merchants couldn't afford that tea. Meanwhile, it was significantly taxed, and British North American merchants began to buy tea at Dutch islands. By the time we get to the 1760s, they're smuggling significant amounts of tea. Some estimates were as high as Thomas Hutchinson, who becomes the governor of Massachusetts in this period, estimates that something like 5/6 of all the tea that flowed into Boston was smuggled during the 1760s and early 1770s. So by the time we get to the Revolution, by the time we get to the imperial crisis anyway, there's this long-standing connection to trade in North America that's not easily separatable. Back to this idea of habit and custom and family ties, this is simply the way that North Americans operate. And as the English pass new laws that are designed to clamp down on smuggling in North America, they essentially create even more smuggling because they're not changing the economic situation and they're forcing merchants to continue to trade as they always have, but now to do so illegally.
So when we're looking at the economic origins of the American Revolution, we probably really need to look at both the French and Dutch influence in these origins, given all the trade that was occurring outside of the British Empire and outside of its laws.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think we need to be a little bit careful sometimes in thinking about drawing a direct line between support for smuggling and the later arguments that are going to come. That is, for a long period of time in the 17th and 18th century, British North Americans resist efforts to control their trade. They protest the Navigation Acts and argue that these things are detrimental to their own economic origins. Usually, however, they do that by calling themselves good English and British citizens. That is, they say things like, you should allow us to continue to trade the French islands because this will make us wealthy and it make us able to buy more British goods and essentially to contribute more to the empire. So what sort of happens by the time we get to the imperial crisis, to the 1760s and 1770s, is that two sort of different narratives, one about taxation and authority of government, gets co-joined with a narrative that's about sort of economic opportunity. And in that way, smuggling becomes politicized in a new way that becomes about economic self-determination that gets tied to language of political self-determination as well. So there is this sort of history of commerce with the Dutch and the French, much of it illegal, that encourages North Americans to think about their economy in ways that doesn't fit into the British Empire. And that has a real implication in allowing them to sort of imagine themselves as having different economic interests and then different political interests as well.
According to the political and economic philosopher Adam Smith, the man who laid the foundations of classical free market economic theory, smugglers weren't people who violated the law of nature or rules of moral behavior. They were excellent citizens who just had the laws of trade changed on them. Smith noted that people who smuggled during the 18th century weren't trying to smuggle or break the law. They were simply trying to continue on with their regular habits of trade. And part of British Americans' regular habits of trade was a trade with Dutch merchants and Dutch traders. British Americans began trading with the Dutch in the 17th century, when English systems of trade and credit weren't developed enough to supply the goods the colonists needed. This trade then continued on into the 18th century and actually increased when the British Navigation Acts artificially inflated the prices of goods to the point where it was just too costly to trade for English goods. So they continued to trade with the Dutch. And as we found out in episode 160, one of the goods they traded for in great quantity was tea. Now, there are definite connections between British North American smuggling and the economic origins of the American Revolution. But as Christian noted, we need to be careful in drawing a direct line between support for smuggling
and the arguments that developed in the 1760s and 1770s related to trade regulation. Because the traditional British American argument in support of smuggling was always tied to their loyalty to the British Empire. It was only during the imperial crisis that this argument started to change. In the midst of this crisis, smuggling was conjoined to arguments about no taxation without representation and imperial governance. And this linkage actually changed the argument about smuggling so that it was less about being subjects of the British Empire and more about ideas of economic self-determination, which in turn became tied to ideas about political self-determination. Now, as many British Americans gradually made their way to ideas about economic and political self-determination, their trade with the Dutch continued. In fact, it came to play a very important role during the Revolutionary War, and also led to that Fourth Anglo-Dutch War that Christian mentioned. But to understand that story, the story of the pivotal roles that the American-Dutch trade played in the Revolutionary War, we'll have to visit with Wim Klooster, so he can take us to that small Dutch island that Christian mentioned, St. Eustatius. Now, you may recall from episode 121 that Wim is a professor of history at Clark University, and he's the author of 5 books, including Illicit Riches, Dutch Trade in the Caribbean, 1648 to 1795, and The Dutch Moment, War, Trade, and Settlement in the 17th Century Atlantic World. Plus, right now, he's presently putting the finishing touches on a 6th book, which he's co-authored with Gert Oostindie, titled Realm Between the Empires, the Second Dutch Atlantic, 1680 to 1815, which will be out in late spring 2018. Thank you for joining us, Wim. We have questions about St. Eustatius and its role in the American Revolution, and we wonder if you could tell us more about it. So, would you start by telling us how this Dutch island developed into a major port and hub of the Dutch transit trade?
Well, St. Eustatius was first settled by a Dutchman in 1636, a man who hoped to make it a tobacco island, but it never became a major producer of cash crops of tobacco or sugar. Instead, very quickly, commercial ties with surrounding foreign colonies were forged, with the English, with the French colonies, and St. Eustatius, in the middle decades of the 17th century, became an importer and re-exporter of products grown outside of the Dutch Caribbean, in the English and the French islands. And then by the late 17th century, it also begins to develop a slave market, providing enslaved Africans to the nearby French and English islands, where the planters were always in need of workers. There was a modest local demand for enslaved Africans as well, but certainly not as large as that of the foreign customers.
When we spoke with you in episode 121 about the 17th century Dutch Atlantic Empire, you noted that the Dutch made a lot of money because they remained neutral during many wars, which really allowed them to take advantage of the fact that even in wartime, everyone needs a trading partner. Did this plan of Dutch neutrality play a role in the development of St. Eustatius into a busy port and transshipment center?
Yes, to some extent, and there's a difference here between the 17th century and the 18th century. In the 17th century, the Dutch themselves are, of course, often involved in wars with Spain, with Portugal, and 3 wars with England. That changes in 1674 when the Dutch West India Company is abolished and re-established, but now it's no longer a war machine. And that means that the Dutch are not on the offensive anymore in the Atlantic world. They keep the colonies that they have, they don't expand. Nevertheless, the Dutch Republic is involved in warfare in the late 17th century, in the early 18th century, in the War of the Spanish Succession. But after 1713, you might say that the involvement of the Dutch in international wars is very minimal. And at the beginning of the 7 Years' War in 1756, they actively revert to a policy of neutrality. And that was in the interest of the Dutch themselves. The Dutch Republic was no longer a major player in European affairs. And to participate in this war that pitted France against Britain, to participate in this 7 Years' War on the British side would have left the Dutch vulnerable on land against the mighty French army. On the other hand, if they had entered a French alliance, they would have been very vulnerable on the seas because the British privateers could be expected to wreak havoc on Dutch global trade. So Dutch States General, the government, argued that neutrality guaranteed that neither of these two belligerent countries, France and Britain, could make a move that would drive the Dutch into the arms of the enemy. Nonetheless, the Dutch do suffer from this policy of neutrality. There's an estimate that in the 7 Years' War alone, ships that they cost the loss to ship owners and investors of some 22 million guilders. But at the same time, we know that many of the ships that were seized were later given back to the Dutch. So they were condemned as prizes, but the High Court of Admiralty in London overturns those decisions. So you might say that despite all these confiscations, despite all these captures, trade remained lucrative enough. So neutrality does play a role there, but it's clearly not the only factor.
It really does seem like trade in the Atlantic was highly lucrative for the Dutch, because many in the 18th century knew St. Eustatius, or Statia, as the Golden Rock. Would you tell us more about that nickname? Why was Statia known as the Golden Rock?
First of all, I've been to the island, and when you approach the island, it does look like a rock rising from the Caribbean Sea. It's a very small island. It's just about 8 square miles, and it doesn't look like a rock, and it became known to the outside world as a Golden Rock, not so much to the Dutch themselves, because of the island's wealth. That was clear once you approach the island, certainly by the middle decades of the 18th century, when new warehouses were built right on the lower end of the island. Land was reclaimed from the sea to build these new warehouses, and trade was clearly thriving. To give you an example, by the early 1760s, each year more than 2,000 vessels cast anchor at Oranjestad at the port each year, which was a dramatic increase from just 30 years before, when there were probably no more than 150 ships that arrived each year. So it was an extremely wealthy island. A lot of wealth was generated. And you had on the island merchants, not just Dutch merchants, but many merchants with a British background, which led to English becoming the chief language spoken on the island already by the early 18th century. Merchants who were looking for both provisions for products from Europe, such as hats and stockings and spices. Spices, of course, originally coming from the East Indies. Glassware from Europe, axes, cotton fabric, linen from Germany. But they were also looking for goods coming from Ireland, including beef and salted fish. From North America, provisions such as cheese and fish from New England, bread and flour from New York and Philadelphia. And then all kinds of building materials were also coming from North America: planks, shingles, hoops, staves, bricks, tar, etc. Then Statia offered massive quantities of rum and molasses, these byproducts of sugar, and certainly the North Americans were very interested in that, these byproducts of sugar. So the sugar originated in the French islands. It ended up, along with the rum and the molasses, in Statia, and was there then bought by North Americans. So it gave rise to a very thriving trade between English and French subjects on the roads of the Dutch island.
And Statia helped facilitate the Dutch trade in tea, too, right?
The tea trade, too, yes. It became one of the main conduits of tea from entering first from Europe and then ending up in North America, the famous tea trade.
As Wim has described for us, Statia developed into a thriving transshipment port for Dutch trade in European, Asian, and West Indian goods in the Atlantic world. And during the American Revolution, it came to play a vital role in the Revolutionaries' war efforts. Wim, would you tell us about the important role Statia played in the American Revolution?
After the start of the American Revolutionary War in 1775, Statia started providing war material, especially gunpowder and naval stores, to the Continental Congress, especially by Dutch firms based in Amsterdam, sending ships with gunpowder to St. Eustatius. And from there, then, ships, very small vessels like sloops, were sent to North America, where in exchange for the arms and the ammunition that they provided, local produce entered station ships like tobacco from the Chesapeake or indigo from South Carolina. So what you find is that these small vessels from Statia anchored a little distance away from, for instance, the port of New York, and from there they would send these contraband goods, as they were considered by the British, in small boats to the nearby port. And we know, for instance, that in the first half of 1775 alone, so the very beginning of the revolution, at least 4,000 barrels of gunpowder arrived in the 13 colonies from the warehouses in St. Eustatius.
How are station and Dutch merchants able to meet the American demand, specifically for military stores like gunpowder?
Well, this has to do with a long-standing trade, of course, between Amsterdam on the one hand and the island of St. Eustatius, the Dutch on the other hand. So the Dutch, partly shielded by their neutrality, met the demand of the North American revolutionaries for gunpowder and naval stores simply by sending it to St. Eustatia, and never minding that it was illegal, because the illicit trade in the Caribbean had made St. Eustatius into what it was, just like the island of Curacao production of gunpowder had their connections with trading firms in Amsterdam and some other Dutch ports, which then sent the goods to St. Eustatius, and from there they arrived in North America.
Now, earlier you mentioned that by the 7 Years' War, the British had a superior naval power to the Dutch. So, as the Dutch were shipping gunpowder from the Netherlands to North America via St. Eustatius, how were they able to avoid the British naval power?
Well, they did not in the long run, because this trade was barely disguised, and it was only a matter of time before the British found out about this, in part because it was a repetition of moves from earlier wars, from the 7 Years' War, in which the Dutch had also shipped massive amounts of gunpowder to St. Eustatius, or earlier during the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s. And usually it was the French who had benefited from this, and the Dutch had been punished by the British privateers in the 1740s and during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. So the same happened again now, and this provoked the ire of British naval commanders in the Caribbean, of course.
Well, before we move on to exploring the ire of British naval commanders, we should talk about one more piece of assistance the Dutch at St. Eustatius gave to the American revolutionaries. On November 16, 1776, St. Eustatius supposedly became the first foreign land to recognize American independence. Vim, would you tell us about the first salute and its significance?
Adding insult to injury, so on top of the shipment of gunpowder and naval stores, the Dutch, at least to many Americans at the time, became known as the first country to recognize U.S. independence. What happened on that day, November 16th, 1776, is that a brig, the Andrew Doria, a ship of the new Continental Navy, arrived in Orange Bay at St. Eustatius and offers a 13-gun salute, one gun for every rebellious colony. That is then answered by the Dutch governor at St. Eustatius with a salute of 11 guns. And this was according to international protocol to respond with a salute, 2 guns less than what you received. But in the eyes of the British, in the eyes of the Patriots, this was tantamount to recognizing the independence of the rebel states. Now, you can argue that the Dutch may not have been the first, that St. Eustatius may not have been the first in that, according to some, the Danish island of St. Croix had already done the same in June of 1776. Others say, well, the first real formal recognition takes place when the alliance with France takes place in 1778, 2 years later. Yet others point to the Republic of Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik, port city of Croatia, which apparently in 1776 already recognized the United States after receiving news of the Declaration of Independence. So there are many, you might say, first salutes, but the first salute with capital letters internationally is still, I think, considered to be the salute given to the Andrew Doria in November 1776 in St. Eustatius.
So, by February 1781, the stations have been trading gunpowder and other war materiel to the American revolutionaries for their war effort, and they were likely the first to formally recognize American independence. Vim, how did the British react to all this? You said earlier that this trade was basically being carried out in the open, so surely the British knew what was going on.
They clearly knew what was going on, and one response on the part of the British is to capture no less than 54 Dutch ships sailing between the Dutch Republic and Statia in 1777. That's one response. So that has, of course, clear consequences for the war effort of the Patriots, in that a lot of gunpowder simply will not arrive, ends up in the hands of the British. More importantly, this ire over the Dutch aid to the rebels helps provoke the British declaration of war against the Dutch in late 1780. Back in the 17th century, as I mentioned before, the Dutch and the English had fought 3 wars ever since. They'd been on good terms, usually allies in international warfare, but now the British declare war on the Dutch, and what is happening in Statia is probably the main factor in this war declaration. So it's war. The people in Statia don't know about this yet when, on February 3rd, 1781, Admiral Rodney arrives with a squadron of British warships. Rodney was a man who had joined the Navy at age 14. He had served as a Navy captain during an earlier war, the War of Jenkins Year, the War of Austrian Succession. He became a member of Parliament. He rose to the rank of Rear Admiral during the 7 Years' War. And in 1779, he was made Commander-in-Chief of Britain's naval squadron in the Leeward Islands of the Caribbean. And he was convinced that Britain would have conquered the southern colonies during the Revolutionary War, if not for the trade of St. Eustatia. So he arrives with a massive naval and army force totaling 3,000 men, and he is bent on ending the prosperity of Statia with one blow.
Yeah, would you tell us more about that blow? As you noted, Rodney arrived in Statia on February 3rd, 1781, with 15 British warships and 3,000 men. So what exactly happened when he arrived?
So they arrive when the island is thriving like never before, and that is in good part because of its role in the American Revolutionary War. Rodney arrives, he arrests, at least according to one source, some 2,000 Americans. He seizes 200 ships. He emptied all the warehouses on the beach, and there are many of them, there are hundreds of them by now. It's very easy for his force to overpower the local garrison because there are only 16 men, so 3,000 versus 60. But what happens then is really remarkable and almost unprecedented, in that for 3 months there is systematic British plunder of the island. Soldiers and sailors go everywhere to find money, to find precious goods. They go dig up earth in the gardens, and they open up floors of houses. They search in the streets. They ask men and women to stop and look what's inside their clothes. Total damages later are estimated to have been something like £7 million. So they arrest all the Americans, put them on boats, send them away. In a way, they don't even distinguish significantly between whether somebody is a North American or somebody is a Brit from Britain or an Irishman, because Rodney considers everybody who's there on the island is guilty of the massive smuggling that takes place and therefore guilty of hindering the war effort on the mainland in North America. Another remarkable aspect of this episode is the harsh treatment that Rodney metes out to the resident Jewish population, which was small, probably 300 to 400, but he imprisons 100 Jews and deports 31 of them and makes a great effort, even more than what he does among other residents of the island, to loot their positions, even going down to the Jewish cemetery and digging it up to search for treasure. So this is quite remarkable because this was not in the instructions that he had been given. He'd been given the instructions to conquer the island. And it's very clear that he's doing this because he's looking for prize money. He's looking for money that he can use himself. So he's on a personal mission here. He'd done that before in his career, coming back with a large amount of loot that filled his own coffers, and that in part enabled him to have a nice country estate. And this comes at a time in his life when he is broke. We know that he was clearly suffering financially, so this to him was a great opportunity, the conquest of St. Eustatius.
So it wasn't really the British government that sanctioned and benefited from the plundering of Statia. Well, I guess other than the benefit that a major American gunpowder supplier had been stifled. But it was really Rodney who benefited from the severe plundering of Statia.
Indeed, it's benefiting Rodney. And there's actually more to this because conquest of St. Eustatia and the plunder of the island has major consequences for what goes on in North America.
Yeah, would you tell us about those major consequences? Because Rodney was in Statia for 3 months to carry out his plundering of the island. And meanwhile, in April, Admiral de Grasse arrives in the West Indies with his French naval fleet and notifies the Comte de Rochambeau that his orders are to sail north to assist the Franco-American forces against the British in North America.
So he doesn't seem to care too much about what is going on in North America, where we are now moving in the direction of the Battle of Yorktown. So Washington with his troops and the French Count de Rochambeau are teaming up for what will be one of the decisive battles of the American War. And what we now know in hindsight is that the battle could not have succeeded without the participation of a fleet that arrived first from France to the Caribbean and then left from Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, for the Chesapeake. And that is a fleet led by the French Admiral, the Count de Grasse, with his fleet of 29 ships, 3,000 soldiers. It arrives at the Chesapeake Bay in September of 1781, and eventually, after a battle is won against a British fleet, manages to blockade the Chesapeake, blockade Yorktown. That means that there is no way out for General Charles Cornwallis, who's in charge of the British troops in the south. So this episode could not have unfolded if Rodney had done his job. So historians have said that Admiral intercepted the fleet as it arrived at Martinique from Europe. He did not do so because he was too busy with the spoils of his successful raid on St. Eustatia. It was still on the island, even though the conquest was by now secure. So he failed to intercept the French naval force before it reached Martinique, and he also neglected to chase it when it sailed from Saint-Domingue, from Haiti, to Virginia. And in both cases, he was motivated by concerns that arose from the merchandise that he had seized in St. Eustatius. He doesn't even bother to go to North America anymore. He delegates his task to Sir Samuel Hood, and he goes back to England trying to defend his actions in St. Eustatius because by now there is quite an uproar about what he has done on the island.
So, due in part to Rodney's preoccupation with St. Eustatius, the Franco-American force defeated the British at Yorktown. Vim, whatever became of Statia after Rodney left with his plunder?
So the island is then very quickly occupied by the French, by 3 French squadrons that overpower the British occupiers that have been left behind by Rodney. And the French only give it back when the Treaty of Paris is signed that ended the American Revolutionary War. St. Eustatius manages to return to its former commercial heights for a little bit in the years afterwards, but by the end of the 18th century it collapses and it never really becomes a major commercial power in the 19th century. So this was the heyday, and the heyday, for all practical purposes, was really ended on that day that Rodney invaded in February 1781.
And what happened with the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War between Great Britain and the Netherlands? When did that war end?
It ended in 1784, and it was a clear sign to the Dutch that they were no longer a great power. That was already known, but this was another way to stress it. The Dutch then undergo a very interesting period in their history because as the 1780s advance, a patriot movement begins in the country that has in some ways similarities to the ideals of the French revolutionaries starting in 1789. But in 1788, there's a Prussian force that overruns the Netherlands, helped by Great Britain, and this patriot revolt is then ended. But in a way, you can see echoes of the American Revolutionary War in the ideology of these patriots, who call themselves patriots, of course, for a reason, and who try to organize themselves in the same way as the American patriots had done during their Revolutionary War.
Reason why the Franco-American forces defeated General Charles Cornwallis and his British army at Yorktown is because of what took place on the tiny Dutch island of St. Eustatius. Instead of intercepting Admiral de Grasse's French fleet when it arrived in the Caribbean, or chasing it up into the Chesapeake Bay, British Admiral George Bridges Rodney stayed in St. Eustatius and plundered it. Rodney's ire towards Statia and the stations represented how many British officials felt towards the Dutch. Since 1775, the Dutch had been supplying the American revolutionaries with gunpowder, naval stores, and other war materiel that helped make their war for independence possible. Why? Because since the 17th century, the Dutch and British North Americans had been trading partners. North Americans traded their tobacco, lumber, indigo, rice, and fish for Dutch cloth, French rum, sugar, and molasses, and Dutch East India Company tea, china, and silk, and most of this trade went through St. Eustatius. And because this trade often occurred directly, Dutch and American traders often circumvented the British Navigation Acts, which meant British North Americans could trade more easily and profitably with the Dutch than they often could legally with their fellow Britons. This local Atlantic trade is how many Americans and the Dutch made money in the 18th century Atlantic world. It's how the small Dutch island of St. Eustatius came to prosper and become known as the Golden Rock. So, was smuggling a big problem in British North America by 1764? As Fabrizio and Christian revealed, that's in the eye of the beholder. British officials and even some merchants in London thought smuggling was a big problem, a problem confirmed by the British officers who had witnessed its frequency during the French and Indian War. But to British North Americans who were able to more easily acquire the goods they wanted and needed cheaper by trading with their Dutch, French, and Spanish neighbors, this was just the way trade had always been conducted in the Atlantic world. In fact, It was only when the British imperial government decided that it would crack down on smuggling, and then made efforts to follow through on that decision in the 1760s, did the nature and habit of trade in the Atlantic world start to change. Only then did smuggling become, quote, a problem in British North America. And only then did people in British North America start to shift their ideas about smuggling away from its traditional context of what it meant to be a loyal British subject, and towards ideas about economic opportunity and self-determination, ideas that made many in North America consider whether they might have different economic interests than the British Empire, which in turn led them to consider whether they might have different political interests as well.
You can find more information about Fabrizio, Christian, and Vim, their books, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/161. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed this look at smuggling in the American Revolution, please tell your friends about Ben Franklin's World and share the show with all the history lovers in your life. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, thinking about both coffee and smuggling, what surprised you most about how ordinary consumer goods like tea, coffee, and sugar could help fuel something as big as the American Revolution? Let me know what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.